money is officially drying up for Prince Harry and Meghan Markle as more and more news of
The whispers didn't start loudly, they never do. They crept in slowly, almost quietly, buried under headlines about property listings, silent financial strain, and that one question nobody could fully answer. Where exactly is Prince Harry now? Because what began as rumors about a Montecito sale didn't stop at real estate, it spiraled into something far darker, far stranger, and far more unsettling. At first, it looked simple. A mansion too expensive to maintain, deals that didn't deliver, a lifestyle that demanded constant income, but insiders began noticing something unusual. The sightings stopped. The casual walks, the staged appearances, the carefully timed paparazzi moments, gone. Completely gone. And when visibility disappears in a world built on image, people start asking questions. Not polite questions, dangerous ones. Because Montecito wasn't just a house. It was a symbol. It was proof that he had escaped, that he had built something new, something independent, something untouchable. But once that symbol started cracking, everything attached to it began to collapse with it. And suddenly, the narrative shifted from freedom to survival. Behind closed doors, conversations reportedly turned urgent. Finances weren't just tight, they were unpredictable. Support systems that once existed quietly stepped back. Calls that would have been answered instantly, now delayed or worse, ignored. And in that silence, something changed. Because according to multiple quiet whispers circulating among insiders, Prince Harry didn't just step back from public life, he vanished from it. Not officially, not dramatically, but subtly enough to make people wonder, was this intentional? Some claim he began moving differently, traveling without announcement, avoiding familiar places, staying away from known circles. Others suggest something even more shocking, that he was advised to do so, not by friends, not by family, but by professionals who understood one thing very clearly: when your identity becomes the problem, sometimes the only solution is to disappear from it. And that's where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Because the idea isn't just that he left Montecito, it's that he left Prince Harry. That behind the headlines, behind the speculation, behind the financial noise, a quieter operation may have been unfolding. A shift, a rebranding, a detachment from the very identity that once defined him. It sounds extreme until you start connecting the details. No public schedule, no confirmed residence, no consistent appearances. And then those strange, almost unbelievable reports began surfacing. Sightings of a man resembling him, but not quite living like him. Driving alone, dressed down, blending in. No security, no entourage, no trace of the royal structure that once followed him everywhere. At first, people laughed it off. Conspiracy, fantasy, clickbait. But then came the more unsettling part, the silence from all sides. No strong denials, no clear confirmations, just that same controlled, calculated absence. And in the world he comes from, silence is never accidental. Silence is strategy. Meanwhile, everything tied to his previous life continued to weaken. The Montecito estate, once a symbol of stability, now viewed as a burden. Partnerships that once defined a new era quietly fading. Public perception shifting from admiration to confusion, and then from confusion to doubt. And inside that storm, the question grew louder: what happens when a man who walked away from one system can no longer sustain the one he built afterward? Some insiders describe it as a breaking point, not loud, not explosive, but internal. The kind that forces decisions most people never have to make. The kind that pushes someone to choose between holding on to an identity or surviving without it. Because identity, especially one as heavy as his, isn't just a name. It's expectation, it's pressure, it's history, and sometimes it's a trap. There are even whispers that legal complications, image control battles, and financial exposure created a situation where staying visible became a risk rather than an advantage. And when visibility becomes dangerous, invisibility becomes valuable. That's when the phrase started circulating. Not officially, not confirmed, but repeated enough to make people pause. New identity, not a legal transformation, not a documented change, but a functional one. A shift in how he moves, how he appears, how he exists in the world. Less like a prince, more like someone trying to escape being one. And if that sounds dramatic, consider the alternative. A man once surrounded by global attention, now barely seen. A life once documented in detail, now reduced to speculation. A public figure whose every move was once tracked, now leaving almost no trace. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens when something changes behind the scenes. Something big enough to rewrite the rules. Something powerful enough to make stepping away feel safer than staying visible. And then there are those late night reports, the ones that sound too raw, too unpolished to be manufactured. Stories of isolation, of long drives, of moments where he's been seen alone, far removed from everything that once defined him. No cameras, no statements, just glimpses. One insider described it in a way that stuck, not as a fall, not as a failure, but as a disappearance in slow motion. Because this isn't a single event, it's a process, a gradual detachment from a life that became too complicated to maintain. And whether that detachment was chosen or forced remains the biggest unanswered question. What makes it even more intense is how little clarity there is from those closest to the situation. No clear direction, no confirmed next move, just a series of shifts that don't quite add up unless you look at them together. A home that may no longer be home, a public identity that may no longer be functional, a future that suddenly looks uncertain in ways nobody predicted. And at the center of it all, a man who once stood at the heart of one of the most powerful institutions in the world, now potentially navigating a life where that power means nothing. The transformation, if it's real, isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, it's quiet, controlled, strategic. And that's exactly what makes it so unsettling. Because when someone like him doesn't just change his circumstances, but changes how he exists entirely, it forces a deeper question. Not where he is, but who he is now. And just when it seemed like the story couldn't get any more unsettling, a new layer quietly slipped into the narrative. One that didn't scream for attention, but lingered in the background like a shadow that refuses to leave. Because disappearing from public view is one thing, but maintaining that disappearance in a world obsessed with tracking every move, every sighting, every rumor, that requires something else entirely. It requires intention. It requires structure. And most of all, it requires a reason strong enough to justify walking away from everything that once defined you. What insiders began hinting at next didn't come from headlines or official statements. It came from patterns. Subtle, almost invisible patterns that only started to make sense when placed side by side. Financial strain was one piece of the puzzle, yes, but not the entire picture. Because even in difficult situations, people with access, with connections, with history like his, don't simply vanish into silence unless there's something deeper pushing them in that direction. There are now whispers suggesting that the Montecito exit wasn't just about money, it was about exposure. Not exposure in the traditional sense, not scandal, not a single explosive revelation, but a buildup of pressures, legal, personal, reputational, all converging at once. And when those pressures reach a certain point, the strategy shifts. You don't fight the storm head on, you step out of its path entirely. Some sources describe a series of quiet decisions made in rapid succession, none of them dramatic on their own, but together forming a clear direction. Fewer public appearances, reduced communication with known contacts, a noticeable change in routines, and then the most telling detail, relocation without confirmation. Not a move announced with press coverage, not a transition documented with photographs, but a shift so controlled that even those watching closely couldn't pinpoint when it happened. And that's when the speculation intensified. Because if he wasn't in Montecito and he wasn't appearing anywhere publicly, then where exactly was he? And more importantly, under what circumstances? There are those who believe he didn't go far, that he remained within reach of familiar environments but adjusted how he interacted with them, living quietly, anonymously, without the identifiers that once made him instantly recognizable. But others suggest something more calculated, that he may have been placed, temporarily or otherwise, into a controlled setting where visibility could be managed, where interactions could be limited, where the outside world could be kept at a distance. And while none of these claims have been officially confirmed, the absence of contradiction only fuels them further. Because in situations like this, clarity usually arrives quickly if the narrative is false. But here, clarity never came. Only more silence, more distance, more questions. Meanwhile, the world he left behind continues to move, but not in the same way. The brand that once carried momentum now feels fragmented, disconnected, uncertain of its direction. The partnerships that once defined a new chapter have either faded or become quiet. And the story that was once controlled so carefully now seems to be unfolding on its own, unpredictable and increasingly difficult to shape. And then there are the personal elements, the ones that rarely make it into official narratives but always exist beneath the surface. Relationships that shift under pressure, trust that becomes fragile, decisions that once seemed aligned suddenly moving in different directions. Because when one person steps into a path of disappearance, intentional or not, it affects everything connected to them. There are even suggestions that that communication between him and certain key figures has become limited, not entirely severed, but no longer consistent. That the alignment that once held everything together has weakened, leaving gaps that are difficult to bridge. And in those gaps, new dynamics begin to form, dynamics that don't always lead back to the same place. At the center of it all remains the most difficult question to answer. Was this a choice or was it a necessity? Because choosing to step away from visibility is one thing. Being pushed into that position by circumstance is another entirely. And the truth may not be one or the other, it may be a combination of both. A situation where the lines between decision and consequence blur to the point where they become indistinguishable. What makes this even more complex is how it reframes everything that came before. The narrative of independence, of building something new, of breaking away from an institution to create a different life, all of it now sits under a different light. Not necessarily erased, but altered. Because if the end result leads to isolation, to uncertainty, to a complete redefinition of identity, then the journey itself begins to look different. And yet, despite all of this, there is one detail that continues to stand out above everything else: the lack of resolution. No final statement, no confirmed direction, no clear indication of what comes next. Just an ongoing process that feels unfinished, unresolved, still in motion. Some believe this is only temporary, that eventually there will be a return, not necessarily to the same position, but to some form of public presence, a controlled re-entry designed to reset the narrative and reestablish a sense of stability. Others are not so sure. They see this as something more permanent, a shift that may not reverse, a decision that once made cannot easily be undone. Because the reality is, once you step outside of an identity that powerful, stepping back into it is never simple. The expectations remain, the scrutiny remains, the history remains, and in some cases, the very reasons that led to the departure are still there, unchanged, waiting. And so the story continues, not with clarity, not with closure, but with the sense of uncertainty that refuses to settle. A figure once defined by visibility, now defined by absence. A life once structured by tradition, now navigating something far less predictable. And somewhere within that uncertainty lies the truth, not fully revealed, not entirely hidden, but waiting for the moment when the silence breaks, when the next move becomes visible, when the question that has been building from the very beginning finally finds its answer. Until then, all that remains are the fragments, the patterns, the quiet shifts that suggest something significant has already happened, even if the full picture has yet to come into focus.